Hello everyone, I'm Martin. I'm a San Francisco-based software engineer, and today we'll be talking about starting a code base on GitHub. We'll start our workflow in GitHub and create our repository and go over some of the settings. Then we'll go over the steps you need to actually push your code online. And at the end, we'll go over some common issues you might encounter when following these steps and what you need to do to actually solve them. Here we are at our GitHub profile page. For the next steps, I'm going to assume that you already have a GitHub profile set up and that you've registered your SSH keys. If you don't have a GitHub account, make sure you sign up for one. You can get one for free. If you can't find your profile page, you can always find it via the drop-down menu under your avatar button right here. To start a new project, let's just go to the repositories tab and click New. This takes us to the Create a New Repository form. Let's start by giving our repository a name. I'm just going to call ours New Project. You can optionally give your repository a description. I'm going to skip this for now because we can do it later. You can choose to make your repositories public or private depending on what kind of settings you want. And the last setting, which is really important, is everything inside this little area. Now, you can choose to start your repository with a few files that GitHub will provide for you. Pay attention to your choices here because there is a potential to create issues. If you are starting your project from scratch on GitHub, that is, you haven't started writing any code whatsoever, but you are creating your repository, you can add these files and there won't be an issue. If you already have an existing repository and you've made commits to it, don't add these files because you will have an issue merging your repositories later. You can tell GitHub to create a README file, a gitignore file, and a license for you. The README file is useful for documentation, and it's a good idea to have it if you are distributing your project to other people. Documentation in general is also a good habit to get into. A gitignore is a file that lists specific files or repositories that should be ignored by Git. And GitHub handily gives you the option to create a gitignore based on whatever language your project is in. Licenses are outside the scope of this tutorial, but you can click on the little icon and read more about them. For our demo repository, I'm going to skip all of these options and I'm just going to hit Create Repository. Okay, if you followed all of the steps up until now and everything was successful, you should be presented with a screen that looks a little bit something like this. Now, GitHub is helpful in that it gives you the steps you need to follow to get your project up and running. These are the steps that we'll be following, but let's actually go over them and see what they're doing. Okay, I've changed my screens a little bit. Here we still have our repository, and here we have Visual Studio Code opened. And the reason for this is just so that we can see our project folder structure and our terminal all in the same window. So the first step we see is we are trying to echo some string, and we're gonna put that inside a file called readme.md. Now you could do this, or you could just create a file, whatever your preference is. So in our terminal, I'm just gonna copy and paste the same command we have on our GitHub page. And we should see that we have a readme file created with the words new project inside. The next step we see is we're trying to initialize our repository. So let's do that. And we see the message that an empty Git repository was initialized. We can also see that in my terminal because we now see that we're on the master branch. Let's now add our file. If we now run a git status, we should see that we're on the master branch, we have no commits, and we have added the README file in the staging area to be committed. So let's do that. Now we've made our first commit. Now for the next step, we see we want to add a remote repository called origin located at this path. It's important to note you don't have to call your repository origin, it's just sort of an established practice. So let's copy the command, paste it. Now by default, Git doesn't actually output whether the command was successful or not. So to check whether it actually worked, you can do git remote -v. V stands for verbose. And you should see the repository called origin and the same path as this one here. And the last steps we want to do is we want to push the master branch to origin. If your SSH key is set up with a password, make sure you add that. Make sure you spell it correctly. After you finally figure out how to spell your password for your SSH key and your push completes, you can refresh the repository and you should see your new file and your first commit in the repository. We only pushed a demo file to our repo, but the idea to take away is the steps you need to take to set up the repository on GitHub. Think of the repo as a blank canvas. You can now push whatever project you are trying to create. With that done, let's look over some issues that you may or may not run into when starting from scratch. Now, for our first issue, we're going to look at an SSH issue. I've gone ahead and I've recreated our repository on GitHub. And you can see here, I followed the steps up until this point. So I've added the remote to our local repository. Now let's try and make a push to our remote GitHub repository and see what happens. If you don't have your SSH keys set up properly, you will run into an issue which says permission denied public key. There's a lot of reasons why you might end up seeing this error message, but I've mostly seen two common scenarios. The first one is that you don't have your SSH key added to your GitHub account, and the second one is that you don't have your SSH key added to your SSH agent. For more details, you can go to Authenticating to GitHub, scroll down until you see Troubleshooting SSH, Error Permission Denied Public Key, the error message we're getting. It's going to list a bunch of error scenarios and things that you could try. Most likely your issue is that you don't have your key in your SSH agent, and if that's your issue, follow these steps. Or you don't have the key attached to your account, in which case you have to follow these steps. In my case, I removed my SSH key from my GitHub account to simulate this error. Let's now look at our second issue. Here we are trying to create our repository again. Remember how we skipped over the initialization last time? Let's actually start by adding some files to our repo. I'm going to start with a README file, a gitignore set up for a node file, and a MIT license. First thing you notice is that we don't get that helpful getting started page. Instead, we see our repo with a commit inside. This commit is made by GitHub for us, and it is the first commit which includes the three files, the README, the gitignore, and the license. Now let's see what happens if we try to push our local repo to our remote repo. I have the repo connected to the remote. However, I also have some commits on my local copy that were made before we created the GitHub repo. Let's do a quick git log to see what's happening. We can see the hash for our commit. It starts with 47A and then just like a bunch of numbers. The latest commit made by GitHub, you can see here, starts with a different hash. So basically our two repositories have two separate commits as their starting points. So let's see what happens if we try to do a git push. We see that our push gets rejected. The reason for this, as we just mentioned, is because the two repositories have two diverging starting paths. Basically, Git doesn't know how to push our local copy into the remote copy. There are ways around this, but they're all fairly involved. The best way is to just avoid this issue to begin with. If you have a local repo that has commits, don't initialize your GitHub repository with files. Just create an empty repo and push all of your local files to GitHub. If you want a README and a gitignore, just create them locally and push them along with all of your changes. So that said, that covers how to start your code base on GitHub. Hopefully it takes off some of those fears and confusion around GitHub. Thanks for watching. You can join the conversation by subscribing to this channel or dropping a comment below. And if you want to take your skills to the next level, start learning on Codecademy today. Have a good one.